Since 1948, the United States has been one of Israel's best friends in the world. Since, I guess, really going back to 1962, when John F. Kennedy said that there was like a special relationship between the United States and Israel, it has only increased and gotten deeper and more secure over the years. And it's become just kind of a muscle movement, a reflexive issue with United States politics and politicians of both sides of the aisle. One of the few things that there's unanimity on between the parties over the years. It's just been a reflexive pro-Israel. Whatever has happened, we always talk about how great Israel is in the Middle East. They're, this island of democracy in a sea of chaos that otherwise reigns over there. That's kind of been the general theme of the story, and it's really been kind of easy. Lots of issues that have been going on with the Palestinians throughout from 1948 forward, but in the American press, that almost never got talked about unless there was a terrorist attack against Israel from that direction. But everything else kind of stayed under our radar. On October 7th, that was shattered, because now then it's all on the front line. And now then it's on front pages across the world. And now people are actually paying attention to both sides of this issue here. And of late, as the war continues to drag on, now with lots of protests in American universities, protests throughout the Middle East and in other parts of the world, other Western nations, people are starting to say, what's going on here? Because most of the press from the West has been, these are anti-Semitic kinds of things. And, they're all bad and they should be suppressed, and they should, kids should be kicked out of school, etc. But now more people are starting to look under the surface and saying, why are they protesting? What are they so upset about? And so now then we're starting to get a more comprehensive picture. Now, we've got somebody on our show today who's been doing a lot more of that and been paying much more attention to the whole issue. And he's come to the conclusion that this reflexive support of the United States towards Israel without questioning anything is not good either for Israel or for the United States. And Gary, let's go ahead and bring up here. We have John Hoffman, who is a research fellow at Cato, especially in defense and foreign policy areas, and has recently written an article, which we're going to discuss in a minute. But first of all, John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Danny.
Listen, this is kind of a controversial issue, and it makes some people uncomfortable to even talk about, because there has been this reflexive muscle movement memory kind of thing to where we just automatically say everything Israel does is fine. But as you've said in a recent article here, maybe it's time to actually examine a little bit more carefully what's going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, really what I'm trying to get at with this article is bringing the discussion back to first order assumptions, saying, what is the history here of this quote unquote special relationship? Why is there this reflexive support? And what, if anything, does this reflexive support yield for the United States, yield for Israel, the Palestinians, the Middle East? So it's trying to bring this back to re-spark a broader discussion.
Well, I think that you've certainly succeeded at doing that. I know this is getting lots of traction on X and several other platforms. And we want to take a look, first of all, at just kind of some of the things that you were writing in there and kind of get you to expound on a couple of the points. And then we're going to actually go to see, how some of this is actually playing out on the media, what their various spokesmen are saying, and just how things are being viewed around the world. So I especially want to get your views on that. But first of all, let's jump into a couple of things specifically that you wrote. One of the ones kind of up toward the front is, you said the Biden administration has said it opposes an invasion of Rafah. That's an area in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, without a credible and executable plan for ensuring the safety and support of the civilians. In an interview with MSNBC, Biden spoke of a red line in response to a question about possible military operation in Gaza, saying we cannot have another 30,000 or more Palestinians dead, end quote. But he then immediately stated that the defense of Israel is still critical, so there's no red line. This incoherence not only negates Biden's leverage, but also binds Washington to whatever policies the far-right government of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ultimately adopts. Now, what is the big risk of that to the United States, and how is that a strategic liability for America?
Yeah, so I think, the impending or looming, possible invasion of Rafah, like has correctly been pointed out as, likely to be the deadliest part of what we have seen so far in the past 7 months. And, when Biden talks about these ethereal red lines, but still stamps approved 100 arms sales since October 7th. Now they just passed the new, multi-billion-dollar package, aid package to Israel. It really demonstrates that there is no red line here. And what I was trying to raise with this specific assertion was by tying ourselves to the hip with Israel and refusing to use any sort of leverage or, real pressure on Israel, the United States is essentially binding ourselves to whatever decision Netanyahu makes, whether he moves into Rafah and just immediately begins a scorched earth campaign, the United States will be there right alongside him.
And why do you propose that's a problem? Because a lot of people are going, yeah, what's wrong with that? That's exactly what we should do.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest problem is, and you on a recent interview, explained it really well. The idea of moving into Rafah and somehow achieving "quote unquote" total victory over Hamas is not only, from a military perspective, near impossible. I remember in your interview you were talking about just the intensity of urban combat. The amount of places for insurgents to hide. How do you identify who is and who isn't Hamas? But by all of these indiscriminate actions taken by the Israeli government within Gaza, you're fueling the sources of armed resistance, of terrorism, so on and so forth. So, and there has not been, the United States has admitted, in the past couple of days, they still don't see a credible path towards protecting civilian life amidst any possible Israeli invasion of Rafah. So, this seems like a recipe for disaster.
Now, I've seen some reports that suggest that Netanyahu actually already wanted to have done this by now, but that apparently behind the scenes, the Biden administration officials have put some brakes on it. Do you know anything about that? And just based on what you've seen, do you think that that's a temporary situation, or if it push comes to shove, might they go forward anyway?
So I've seen a couple competing, narratives here. I've seen one, that the United States is behind the scenes trying to pressure Israel not to do this, presenting their, Israel, Saudi, mega, for normalization as, a substitute for going into Rafah. I've seen it framed. I think it was Tom Friedman who framed it in his New York Times article. Netanyahu has to choose Rafah or Riyadh. But I think also, I've seen a lot of, competing narratives saying, Netanyahu and his team likely recognize how, much of a catastrophe an invasion of Rafah would be, especially, for Israeli forces too.
Yeah.
And by continuing to deflect an invasion of Rafah and by framing it as, being put on hold or being halted because of the United States, Netanyahu's overall strategy of "quote unquote" total victory over Hamas, which is, I would argue, and a lot of people have argued, is, virtually impossible. He can kind of blame the United States, saying, oh, if only we had gone into Rafah, we would have been able to succeed. But, Washington is the one that held us back. So,
so how does he square that with his insistence, emphatically stated over many times over the last month, 5 or 6 weeks, I guess, at least, that victory is impossible without going into Rafah? He said, if we don't go into Rafah, you might as well be saying just surrender to the Hamas or whatever. How does he square that with, I mean, I can't imagine him going, well, darn it, I was going to do it, but Big Joe stopped me, so how does he's painted himself into a corner, it seems to me like, and I don't know how he gets out of it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think he's really backed himself into a corner here. And I think it was just this morning, it was reported that, even if this ceasefire deal, that they're trying to put together goes through, I think for 40 days, he stated this morning, we're going to go into Rafah regardless of any, ceasefire deal, saying that he would go in after. So, no, I think he's, backed himself into a corner here where he's internationally isolated. He knows, that his, ruling coalition, is incredibly far right. They definitely want to go into Rafah.
Right.
So I think he is, he is in quite a bind here on what to do. He's likely recognized that this total victory is virtually impossible unless you decide to just completely slaughter every single person within Gaza. And I think he sees his back against the wall.
Yeah, and we'll see how that plays out there, because that's a really sensitive issue. One of the other issues that you said in your article here, of a concern for the United States about a strategic vulnerability, is the possibility for expanded regional war. Specifically, what you wrote, Gary, if you can throw that second one up there. Was you said Washington's unwavering support for Israel amid war in Gaza has also disastrous regional ramifications. From the Eastern Mediterranean to the Red Sea to a series of different flashpoints risk dragging the region and the United States into full-scale war. And ironically, in the Wall Street Journal, I think it's this morning, actually, they seem to be saying, yeah, that's really a great idea. The title here is that Hezbollah stumbles into war of attrition, but then you see the subhead there, Lebanese group isn't ready for larger conflict. Israel shouldn't let that opportunity go to waste. And then inside the article, they write, Israel therefore must press its advantage and exploit Hezbollah's mistakes of launching a war of attrition. Whatever happens in Gaza, Jerusalem must continue to hit the group, its asset, especially in Lebanon. If Israel accepts a ceasefire with Hezbollah, the group will continue to build its war machine until it's ready to use it to imperil the Jewish state one more time. All but saying Israel should attack and invade into Hezbollah, which could, of course, spark a wider war. And I know that there are many in the Israeli government who have openly said that's exactly what they plan to do. And on that point, and just kind of a sub question here before you get the bigger one here, what is your assessment of the contention that whether there's a ceasefire or not a ceasefire, once Israel, quote, finishes off Rafah, and it declares anyway that they've defeated the last 4 battalions, that they're going to roll north into Hezbollah anyway? What do you think of those claims?
Well, so on the first point of the risks of this evolving into a full scale war, I didn't see that headline from Wall Street Journal this morning, but yeah, no, this is terrifying. This whole conflict, this arc of escalation that we've seen from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, now between Israel and Iran directly, this really risks spiraling out of control. And what we've seen over the past 7 months is just a continual rolling of the dice, kind of a crossing, our fingers, saying, hopefully, this doesn't lead to the other side, viewing this as an actual, act of, war against one another. And what we see too is with all of these different flashpoints, all of these different actors involved, whether it be Hezbollah in Lebanon, the militias in Iraq and Syria, now between Israel and Iran directly, the Houthis down in Yemen, all these different flashpoints and all the actors involved really raises the risks for miscalculation. And, all of these flashpoints really have the escalatory potential to spiral out of control. On the part about, whether Israel will push into Lebanon, even if they, reach some sort of agreement in Gaza, I think that still remains to be seen. I would hope for, the region's sake, for Israel's sake too, that they would see this as, not beneficial to their own interests. This would further destabilize the Middle East considerably. Hezbollah is not Hamas. Hezbollah is much more capable than Hamas. This would likely result in a lot of, Israeli casualties as well. I think we've seen over the past 7 months, 260 or so members of Hezbollah killed. And then I think, the number was, like 15 Israeli soldiers and then another 15 Israeli civilians killed, but with this tit for tat exchanges. So, we've already seen that this has the potential for violence on both sides, and this spiraling out of control would likely ratchet this up to a new level.
And then, of course, you have all the pressures of potential the United States getting involved, which we already have done, not just in the Red Sea, not just against the Houthis in Yemen, but also directly against an Iranian attack. I mean, we keep getting further and further. Our troops have been killed in Jordan already over some stuff in Syria. So it's already, we've eked into it. We're a little bit into the gray zone and maybe even a little across, but it hasn't exploded yet. And that's a continuing concern the United States has to have, which we seem to pay too little of attention to. Now, one of the last things that I'll cover here in just a minute is some of your recommendations of what we should do. Before we get into that, though, I want to cover some things that have been happening in the news here over the last couple of months and some of the things that are still going on here today that I think highlight some of the risk to the United States and how we're viewed in the region, the risk to our country of, also getting sucked into a war. But then also, I think that some people are not aware of just how much animosity is being heaped, not just on Israel for what they're doing, but on us because of how we're being seen as either complicit in supporting it or weak in not being able to have a say in it. And so I want to get your view on a couple of things that have been happening recently. First of all, I want to look here that, Biden and Secretary Blinken have been very outspoken in saying a two-state solution is absolutely America's view here. Here's Biden.
As we look to the future, the only real solution to the situation is a two-state solution over time. And I say this as a lifelong supporter of Israel. My entire career, no one has a stronger record with Israel than I do. I challenge any of you here. I'm the only American president of Israel in wartime. But there is no other path that guarantees Israel's security and democracy.
Okay, well, that's Biden's view. Secretary of State Blinken, who's now made many trips to the Middle East, threw his 2 cents in.
But with regard specifically to normalization, the Crown Prince reiterated Saudi Arabia's strong interest in pursuing that. But he also made clear what he had said to me before, which is that in order to do that, 2 things are required: an end to the conflict in Gaza and a clear, credible, time-bound path to the establishment of a Palestinian state.
So now here's my problem, John, and I want you to comment on how you view it and if you have any knowledge of how others in the region view it as well. You see that emphatic, and I could have put as probably 4 or 5 more where Biden himself said a two-state solution is the American policy, and certainly Blinken and some others. But then you hear this from Netanyahu.
In the future, the state of Israel have to control on the entire area from the river to the sea. This is what happens when you have sovereignty. This truth I say to our American friends. And I also stopped the attempt to impose us a reality that will jeopardize us. A prime minister in Israel has to be able to say no, even to the best of friends.
So he's very outspoken in saying, I'm just going to say no. So you keep saying two-state solution, and I keep saying no. How's that going to work out?
Yeah, so there's a complete disconnect between, the rhetoric that the United States is putting out and, what Israel's ruler is saying. And there's also a complete disconnect between what the United States is saying and the actual policies that it's pursuing. It talks about this pathway towards a two-state solution. Okay, well, let's look at this rhetoric that's coming out of Israel from Netanyahu. He says that he needs to control everything from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. He has repeatedly reiterated how proud he is to have historically prevented a two-state solution. He has lobbied his own party and the Israeli public more generally by saying he and he alone is the one capable of preventing a two-state solution. So we see a complete lack of intention on the Israeli side to ever move towards a two-state solution. Then when we see this rhetoric coming out of Washington, we see, what policies has the United States done to work towards a two-state solution. I see 100 arms sales since October 7th. I see, continuous U.S. vetoes at the UN Security Council to halt the violence. I see the United States, it's laughable because, it's not just myself who sees this. It goes back to your point that you were making before asking this question is how does the region view this? How does the world view this? They see this hypocrisy. They see this empty rhetoric. And, this is undermining U.S. interests, America's image for generations, and we've seen across the Middle East in the past several months, we've seen widespread protests. We've seen an outpouring of anger towards the United States. Mark Lynch, a professor over at GW, put out a really good article in Foreign Affairs called "The Coming Arab Backlash," and I agree with them. This is at some point, and these are, here's some protests here in Israel. There is such wide anger and discontent right now that the idea that this isn't going to come blowing back in our face, whether now or later, is just incorrect.
Yeah, and I guess that gets back to the thesis of this whole show and your article, is that there is a strategic vulnerability for the United States to keep doing this. I get it that it's been. I think you even used the phrase in the article at one point that there's like this muscle memory towards reflexive whatever Israel says we just go with, and there really hasn't been any blowback until this war has broken out, and now it's just exploded and killing so many thousands of Palestinians. I think that's been the real difference in the past. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And, and I think too, just I think social media and a lot of, these mediums play a role because we can just, I know myself, I turn on, log on to Twitter and there it is, the videos are there clear for everybody to see. The targeting of like the World Central Kitchen staff the other week, the pictures of the cars, were shared on social media, the strikes, all these things, it's impossible to argue against what is just being so well documented in Gaza, despite efforts by, some to skew, this, pretty clear information that's coming out that there really is no strategy on the Israeli side aside from just the systematic destruction of life and infrastructure in Gaza.
And now I will take issue with one thing you said there, because you said it's impossible to argue. It's not impossible to argue because that's happening a lot. And I'm going to show you here.
That's true.
But it's impossible to rationally argue, I think maybe is what we're going to say here. Because, let me just play it here. So, first of all, let's see. So here's Netanyahu talking about what their next level of operations is going to be.
I've instructed the army accordingly to give us a plan, a dual plan. One, to vacate the population, the civilian population, because we're not fighting them, we're fighting the terrorists. And secondly, to destroy those remaining battalions. Victory is within reach, and we should all strive for that common target to destroy Hamas, because that gets all the other objectives within our purview. It also gets something else. It gives us hope for the Middle East, hope for peace. You can't have that with Hamas remaining intact.
Is he right there? Is there hope for the Middle East and hope for peace in the region if he gets his total victory in Rafah?
No, because I think this idea of total victory, from its very core is one, not working, even on Israel's own terms. This idea of total victory over Hamas, the complete political and military elimination of Hamas as any sort of force, as well as, part of this, total victory is also getting the hostages back. On both of these fronts, this hasn't worked. Khaled al-Gindi, a Palestinian academic, he wrote a really great article also for Foreign Affairs, talking about how this, you can degrade Hamas militarily, but the ability to eliminate it as a political force within Gaza or Palestinian politics writ large, and the ability to eliminate armed resistance as an element of this situation without any credible path towards a real political solution is just impossible. And you're right. I shouldn't have said it's impossible to argue that against this. It's impossible to rationalize in a logical manner against this. You're right. And so no, what we're seeing is this path to quote unquote peace in the Middle East is this finishing up the job in Gaza, and brokering this grand mega deal between the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, which has been presented as a way to preserve a two-state solution, balance against Iran, counter China's ambitions in the long term, cure world hunger, and they're just throwing so many things in here. But no, when you just take a step back and look at this, none of it really adds up.
Yeah, and so speaking of things not adding up, or maybe they are adding up just in a way that's disturbing. It may be a better way to put this. So now I'm going to show you kind of a series of different clips here and different statements, and what I think that this really underscores, and one of the things I want you to speak on as we go through here is what kind of a impact, harm does this do to American credibility, America's reputation, and therefore our ability to do anything elsewhere in the world and hold people accountable when they do things that are wrong, when they see us turning a blind eye to things like this. So first of all, here's Netanyahu just a few days ago basically saying how he's a victim.
We see this exponential rise of anti-Semitism throughout America and throughout Western societies as Israel tries to defend itself against genocidal terrorists who hide behind civilians. Yet it is Israel that is falsely accused of genocide, Israel that is falsely accused of starvation and all sundry war crimes. It's all one big libel. But that's not new. We've seen in history that anti-Semitic attacks were always preceded by vilification and slander.
So for no good reason, people are protesting like the ones that we saw there a second ago in Israel itself, or all these that are happening on American universities. It's all just people being bad to the Israelis, like there's nothing going on. And he specifically cited in there how it was libelous and lies that they're starvation because there's no truth to it. Now, here's something that happened on, this is on MSNBC on April 7th. So what is that? More than 3 weeks ago. Here's what they said then.
Right now, the entire population of Gaza, 2.2 million people, do not have enough available calories. Half the population, 1.1 million people, are on the brink of acute starvation, and famine is projected to take hold in northern Gaza anytime between now and May. This is all according to a UN-backed report by the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. That assessment was from mid-March, by the way, and less than 3 weeks later, the situation has escalated dramatically. In a government cable obtained by the Huffington Post, a group of humanitarian experts from the U.S. Agency for International Development are warning that famine is already likely happening in parts of Gaza. Goes on to say that the spread of hunger and malnutrition in Gaza amid Israel's offensive is, quote, unprecedented in modern history, and that the pace of hunger-related deaths will accelerate in the weeks ahead.
Okay, that was 7 April. Now then on 24, 25 April, it got worse. Check this out.
The situation in Gaza is extremely worrying. We all know that we are getting closer by the day to a famine situation. Malnutrition among children is spreading. Okay, we estimate 30% of children below age of 2 is now acutely malnourished or wasted. And 70% of the population in the north is facing catastrophic hunger. There is reasonable evidence that all three famine thresholds, food insecurity, malnutrition, and mortality, will be passed in the next 6 weeks.
Now, what happens in the next 6 weeks? Now, other reporting has gone into a little bit more detail on this, and this is so anguishing to me that I can't hardly even express, is that it may be to the point that right now, for many of the people, it's already too late. And within 6 weeks, there will start to be large-scale deaths based on what they said. Once they pass those 3 thresholds that he mentioned there, and they said potentially 40 to 60,000 people could literally start starving to death, and it may be too late for some of that. That stuff is out there. That's USAID. That's not Hamas propaganda. That is our own governmental agency reaching these conclusions along with other independent viewers. Now, when you hear Netanyahu saying it's all liable, it's liable, it's not even true. There's no hunger going on. We're not doing anything to stop them. But they say emphatically, and yet our own government, this State Department also has said that there is evidence where Israel is specifically blocking the food. How do those things line up when it's in the region, and what does that do to our credibility?
Yeah, it is our own government who are raising these alarms. Why would we be? I think it's still largely theatrical, but look at the whole fiasco surrounding the pier that's being built off of Gaza. Why is it that the United States is raising these objections? Saying that food isn't and food and resources aren't getting to the people of Gaza. So we're going to build this pier. It's being blocked by the government that you are actively supporting. So now you're trying to, circumvent a blockade that you're, essentially subsidizing. But no, what this does to our credibility around the world is it destroys it. It destroys any semblance of an American-led or a Western-led rules-based order. People see the hypocrisy between, U.S. statements, say, on Ukraine, which you've done a really great job covering on this show. And, they see, U.S. rhetoric regarding Ukraine, and then they see U.S. actions in places like Gaza. And it just shows this hypocrisy at such a global scale that it's undermining America's image to really present itself as any sort of, neutral actor, or, and it provides ammunition for, our adversaries to also say, see, this is what the United States and their rules-based or liberal world order, whatever you want to call it, this is what it's always been all about. So, it's undermining our credibility. It's undermining our ability likely in the future to manage conflicts or to de-escalate conflicts, particularly in the Middle East. And, this is going to have generational ramifications that I think people like Biden and, some of the older guard in DC just either don't care or aren't aware of.
Well, and here's what's going to exacerbate that situation. Just the facts out there that I've already shown you already has caused that damage. But it gets even worse when at a State Department briefing on the 25th of April, so just a couple of days ago, about 5 days ago, I'm sorry, the State Department official, Mr. Patel, was asked specifically about this, and what did the United States do to it? Now, listen how forcefully and, we're going to launch into action. Well, not really. Here's what he said.
David Satterfield, Envoy David Satterfield, in his last appearance, warned that there's a strong possibility of famine in the north of Gaza. Yesterday, Giancarlo Siri, the head of the WFP, he says we're 6 weeks away from famine. Are you aware of these reports? And what is the position of the United States in terms of having some sort of urgent plan to deal with this?
Well, Saeed, I'm pretty sure I'm aware of these reports because I was standing right there when David Satterfield said them. Right. You saw the ambassador speak pretty clearly about the positive steps that we are seeing on the humanitarian ecosystem, things that we believe are moving in the right direction. Some gates opening up, some ports opening up, some additional flows of trucks. But I cannot stress this enough, and I'm sure if the ambassador was here with me, he would say the same thing. More needs to be done. Absolutely more needs to be done to avert this pending crisis in Gaza. We need more deconfliction mechanisms in place. We need aid entering at a higher rate. We need all of these things to happen, and we'll continue to push our partners in Israel. We'll continue to push other partners and other humanitarian actors to do so.
The specific question he was asking is, what urgent steps will the United States take to prevent this kind of literally large-scale death-causing incident? And what do we say? well, we've really tried to push back a lot here. And he went on to say after that, I did cut it off after that, but that they hired some new woman to start a new section of the State Department to look into this further. All it takes is for the president to pick up a phone and saying, damn, Bibi, get this done, get this fixed. What the hell's going on over there? Something like that. Decisive leadership at the top level. There's none of that. So people around the world, and I'm seeing it rolling through the comments here of the people who are watching this show right now, a lot of which I can't put on there because of the strong feelings that displayed. But and I assure you, that's very symptomatic of what we see across the board here, that people say you're just sitting passively by while your own people tell you thousands of people are about to starve to death. And going back again to the thesis of your article here, this is causing enormous harm to the United States strategically because of our inaction.
Yeah, and the way that I've framed it over the past 7 months is Biden and his administration sound like they're somebody angry at a restaurant that wants to see the manager. Newsflash, you're in charge and you're the one signing all of these weapon deals. You're the one providing all of this diplomatic cover. You are the manager in this situation here. This is happening directly underneath your, supervision. This is, crazy to think that the United States doesn't have the ability to shape outcomes on the ground. And, it's been 7 months of, like you and myself, of slamming our heads against the wall, and, I kind of want to go back to that quote by Bill Clinton, who's the effing superpower here? We're being, led by the nose here by a state that is clearly pursuing policies contrary to our strategic interests, clearly very contrary to the values that we claim to stand for as a nation. But yet the United States keeps going back to this reflexive or muscle memory support, whatever you want to call it. It's just what we see is just an emphatic embrace of the status quo, an inability of the United States to say, maybe we should adjust course.
I saw, John, I think one of the most recent ramifications of all the things you're talking about here was Secretary of State Blinken just a few days ago had the temerity to stand up in front of some microphones and blast China because of their actions against the Uyghurs. And he used the word genocide again, even though China isn't actually killing anybody over there. And now China's doing some bad things to the Uyghurs and stuff that I think that we should take a stand against. But they literally laughed at us when we say, you want to sit there and talk about what China's doing to the Uyghurs, and you turn a blind eye to what's going on in the Gaza, where there's actually a genocide going on, where tens of thousands of people are dying. And so any chance we may have ever had to use our moral authority to help or not force, but compel China to change their policies, now then they'll just laugh at us and do whatever they want to do. And I can't imagine that's going to be an isolated situation.
No, of course. And I think it goes back to this, undermining of American interests in not just the Middle East, but abroad, this loss of moral authority, this loss of, the rhetoric surrounding, we're fighting for, a rules-based order, a liberal world order in Ukraine. That's just the most recent example and the most, blatant contradiction, between U.S. policies here is Ukraine and Gaza. But, it's just, I would say it's laughable if it wasn't just so sad. I think one example that is a personal example of mine that might be good to share is, I'm a Middle East guy. Academic background in Middle East, everything Middle East. There's a lot of people who, are in the Middle East, other academics and so on and so forth, that really don't want to work with people from the United States right now, people that I've typically, worked with in the past and stuff like that. They said, we don't want to be associated with anybody from the United States right now. And to me, that was really shocking because it said, look at what the United States is doing to the image of, people, even myself that have no association with the government, people just don't want to be associated with the United States right now.
Wow, that is troubling. I mean, at the government level, I can understand, but typically that are willing to engage with other Americans, especially those who are trying to kind of lie on things that are telling the truth. But that is indicative of maybe just how deep this is running here. And I keep seeing on mainstream media, especially a lot of the coverage of all of these protests at universities throughout the United States, they seem to be sticking with the deal that this is an anti-Semitic thing and that it's anti-Israel. Not even talking about the policy issues, not talking about, even though the students themselves are emphatic about saying it's because of how the Palestinian people are being treated. There is this fringe among some of these supporters of the protests where they're actually saying pro-Hamas kind of thing, and man, the news zeroes in on those and ignores the vast majority who just care about the people, and so we're not doing ourselves any favors, even on the home front.
Yeah, no, of course, there are some, protesters, among these groups that, either A, just don't really know what they're talking about, they're college students, or B, or might just be repeating things that, they've heard from others. But no, the vast majority of these protests are in protest of Israel's policies. And, this label of anti-Semitism, this label of being anti-Semitic, if I had $1 for every single time I've been accused of being anti-Semitic since October 7th because of my writings, I'd probably never have to work again. But what these students are showing is a tremendous popular discontent with U.S. policy, with Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. And what I hope this shows the United States government is that the tide is turning, especially generationally. Even if people like, the old guard don't want to change course, people in my generation and the generation below me, this will likely have a transformational effect on how we view U.S. engagement with the Middle East, with Israel, with the world more generally. And I think, I think these protests are, a sign of times to come in terms of change policies once, the kind of the old guard, the Brett McGurks of the world, the Joe Bidens of the world, leave their office.
Yeah. And of course, what just anguishes me is that, as we mentioned a minute ago, this, whatever happens in Rafah is not going to end the world. There will be no military victory, no matter what Netanyahu says. The instability will continue on. And I fear what may happen as we continue to go forward, because now then they've already fought a war. They will have spent whatever the number is by then, 7, 8, 9 months. And then what? They got to figure out what to do next, because they have nothing but wreckage and no apparent path to create even stability, much less peace. And so this could get a lot worse. Now, I want to turn now, though, to toward the end of your article there, where you at least put out some suggestions for what we could do. So if President Biden decides he wants to watch this show, and we certainly hope that he does, I'm actually going to tag him on this at the end, by the way, not a joke. So if he happens to tune in here, here's what you wrote in your piece here, that it's time to normalize the United States relationship with Israel. This does not mean making Israel an enemy of the United States, but rather approaching Israel the same way that Washington would approach any other foreign nation, from arm's length. No longer would decisions about military aid, arms sales, or diplomatic cover be rooted in a path to dependency or muscle memory, but rather in officials' perception of the U.S. interest at stake. How? Because I think elsewhere in this article, you talk about how we treat other allies and other friends, and it's not reflexive here. So if you could tell us a little bit about how that works and what we should be doing, how that should translate into policy right now.
Yeah, of course. And this is kind of, the argument that I've been making, and, that some people have, accused my writing of. They said, oh, you want to make Israel an enemy of the United States? No, I'm saying it's time to normalize our relationship with Israel, treat it the way the United States should treat any other state on planet Earth, which is from arm's length and from a perspective of U.S. interests, even with U.S. treaty allies, France, Japan. There's a push and pull. There's a give and take here in these relationships. But with Israel, what we've seen is just continuous give. There is no take here. It's very unidirectional. So what I'm calling for, here is a recognition that the United States should, approach Israel just the way it approaches any other state. I think, Jefferson said it best, when he was, summing up how the United States, foreign policy should operate. He said, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. And, that is
and then you got to add Washington saying, don't have permanent enemies or permanent friends. Keep it all at arm's length.
Yeah, keep it all at arm's length. There needs to be this ability to differentiate between American and Israeli interests. They are not the 51st state. With the United States facing the global context that it faces today, we're deeply involved in Ukraine. We're tensions between China and Taiwan are heightening by the day. We're continuing to get sucked into the Middle East. At home, we're $34 trillion in debt, running $2 trillion a year deficits, incredibly polarized here at home, coming up on an election that is likely to be very dicey. On the list of priorities, subsidizing Israel's disastrous military campaign in Gaza should be way down on the list here, to put it
One
nicely.
might even say off the list.
But
at least lower down.
Yeah, at least at the very least lower down. I mean, the notion that the United States can be everywhere doing everything all at once, especially supporting such horrible things like what's happening in Gaza, is ultimately what I think is going to be our ruin.
Wow. Well, I certainly hope we don't get there. I mean, I would like to say I hope that sanity could return and actually inform our policies. But I mean, if this administration wins the next election, or if who I've seen projected to be in the next government, if Trump should win, it doesn't really give me a lot of optimism in that. But there's at least hope. And we're at least grateful for people like you who are taking the heat on this and continuing to put out stuff that makes sense, that's actually sane and good for America, instead of some of this nonsense that's been going on. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you coming on the show today.
No, thank you for having me on, Danny. Thank you for everything that you do with your show.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that too. And we also thank you guys for coming on, because like you see with this show here, we remain unintimidated and uncompromised in bringing the truth. Even if it makes people uncomfortable, they deserve to know the truth. And as I said a minute ago here, I'm actually going to tag this to the President of the United States today. I'm going to send this out there so that he sees there is another path, another possibility, instead of going down a bad road here, and ask you to do the same thing. Take this episode here, any others that you see that are good, that you like, and share them on social media. Tag other people on Twitter or X and other social media you have. Send this out there so people see it's not just this nonsense that's coming out of official Washington. Some in America are actually trying to do something about it. And we appreciate your participation with us, because we are, folks, genuinely all in this together. Do come back and join us later today, because we're going to be talking with Jason Beardsley again, a really excellent analyst. We're going to be looking at the Ukraine side of this problems that we're having here. Are they destined to be in NATO even while retreating? Now, that sounds kind of an odd thing to say, but almost as odd as what we've been talking about in the Middle East. And join us at 2 p.m. today, Eastern time, and you'll see why. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.